Good morning. Looks like we've got folks that are starting to sign on here. Let's give everyone just a minute to log in. So thanks for joining us this morning. This panel is Life Sciences in the Law, Opportunities and Pitfalls. My name is Christina Brown Marshall. I'm a partner at Fish and Richardson here in Atlanta. And my practice specializes in intellectual property issues and products liability issues for medical device and pharmaceutical and life sciences companies. So the genesis for the panel today, and kind of what sparked the idea for this panel is, we as people who work in the life sciences and biotech and medical community are really uniquely situated in helping out and getting involved with and dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic that the country's facing right now. This is really, when it comes down to it, this is a biological problem, and the solutions that come out of this are going to be biologically focused solutions. And the companies and the groups that are working in this area have a lot of tools that folks in other spaces just don't have. And this, the presence of those tools was really highlighted for me. I was having a conversation with a biotech client. This was a few months ago, and I was asking him, how are things going for you? How's everyone doing? Have you been able to keep your labs open? And he kind of laughed at me and he said, we're a lab. We just developed our own COVID test, and now we run our own test and we test our people, and everyone gets periodically tested, and we've been doing fine. We haven't had to shut down at all. And that really sort of highlighted for me the fact that these companies are in a really unique position, but we also need to be thinking about, how do you capitalize on this position? Can we use the problems that we're tackling now and the tools that we're developing to tackle those problems as an opportunity to make changes that will put the life sciences community, the medical organizations, in a better position post-pandemic? So I know there's a lot of panels that are talking about COVID-19 from various angles today. Our panel is going to focus on this from a legal angle. So we're going to discuss, from a legal perspective, what sort of pitfalls could lie in the way to these solutions that the life sciences companies are working on, and what doors are there that could be opened that could make some changes that could improve things post-pandemic. So our speakers today are going to touch on different facets of life sciences and medicine, and how those relate to sort of these legal questions. And we're going to talk about things from product liability perspective, FDA regulatory perspective, government relations, and telemedicine. So the discussion today is going to be an informal discussion. We'll have the chat function available, so if anyone has any questions while we're having our discussion, feel free to send those to me. We can answer questions in real time, and also we can leave some time at the end for answering questions too. So with that, I'll have the other speakers on the panel, if you could just introduce yourself and maybe say a quick word about sort of your background and what your work is. We go to Matt. You want to start with you?
Yeah, I'm Matt Lyon. I'm at Augusta University. I'm an emergency physician, and I'm also the medical director for telehealth for Augusta University Health. And so we've been providing telemedicine services for a while, but since COVID came around, we've been providing telemedicine services with the rural hospitals in our region, both in the emergency department as well as on their floor and in their ICUs, to help patients with COVID and patients that can't get out of the rural hospitals, making sure that they have adequate care and the same care they would get if they were here in the hospital here. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks for joining. Montan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Christina. My name is Mantan Bhatt. I'm Director of State Government Affairs at the Advanced Medical Technology Association, AdvaMed. We're the world's largest trade association representing medical device manufacturers. We've got a wide range of members from some of the biggest companies in America to some very small startups and that are making big impacts. And big thank you to Georgia Bio for inviting us, and big thank you to Maria Thacker. It's been a great meeting so far, and I look forward to having some of these conversations today.
Great, thank you. John, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is John Murphy. I'm Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, the National Biotech Association. So I am in charge of the legal group that covers all of our healthcare related issues. So this is I think really a timely panel, and I applaud the Georgia Bio team and Christina for putting it together, because I think there's a lot we can talk about. I think there are a lot of opportunities. I have spent all of my time since I have been sheltered into my basement office that is not very exciting, as you can see behind me, dealing with various and a variety of COVID-related legal issues. And I think what we'll talk about today should be really interesting for companies who are just dipping their toe into the waters on this issue, or who are all the way into a clinical development program.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Jeff, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Christina, and thanks to everybody for being here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm Jeff Drake. I'm a partner at King & Spalding in our office here in Atlanta, and I co-chair our pharmaceutical and medical device litigation practice. So I primarily represent manufacturers in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and other spaces in individual mass tort and class action product liability related litigation. During the pandemic, for the first few months and still continuing now, I've spent a lot of time advising pharmaceutical, medical device, vaccine, and other manufacturers on COVID-19 litigation concerns, including PrEP Act immunity and state, federal, state legislative and executive orders that could apply as well. I'm also representing and advising healthcare providers, particularly in the senior care and other long-term health spaces, on COVID-19 wrongful death litigation, which has implicated a number of issues that are equally applicable to the life sciences space, and look forward to chatting about those today.
Great. All right, thanks everyone. So I think to start off, it would be great to hear everyone's thoughts on what you've seen to be the most significant change for life sciences and medical organizations so far as a result of the pandemic.
Should we just jump in? You want me to go first?
Sure. Jump right in, please.
Sure. So I guess I've had a kind of a unique opportunity, because Bio, we represent all facets of the healthcare biotech sector. So we have very large established companies as well as small pre-revenue companies. And since we discovered, when was it, in the middle of January, the initial genome, or that's probably the wrong term. Dr. Mack can help me on that. But basically, since companies discovered what COVID was and they understood what the general infrastructure was, just to tell you, as of this morning, there are 766 unique active compounds in development to some way eradicate, to develop a treatment or a vaccine for COVID, right? So if you think about it in the perspective of what opportunities exist for biotech, it dwarfs every other clinical development program we have had on a year-over-year basis. To think that, if you think about vaccines, I've worked in vaccines for a long time. We have this trickle of vaccines that occasionally pop up here and there, in all of the different little spaces. There are 193 clinical development programs related to vaccines against COVID right now. So I think what you've seen is this transcontinental shift all over the world in focusing efforts to defeat this pandemic. And I say that because, one, I think it's crazy to think about how many companies shifted on a dime, or pulled assets off the shelf, pulled research out of the clinic and said, how can we focus and fight this? But two, it presents this sort of weird dichotomy of, there is unlimited opportunity in the COVID space right now. There's going to be legal issues associated with this, pricing issues associated with this, access issues associated with this, all of which are really important. But it may be that there comes a time where the industry all of a sudden has to take a step back and say, holy cow, somebody fixed it, or somebody got the right generation vaccine and they've got a handle on it. we now have to start thinking about what is the future for our clinical development programs that we have completely shifted. And it's not to say there won't be room. There's certainly going to be room for multiple vaccines, for multiple treatments, but there will be an end, I hope. And I think that the consideration, sort of in the legal suites now and in the business development suites now is making sure we have our eye on the ball of treating or getting through the COVID pandemic, but also making sure we're not stuck in a no man's land when ultimately we might not be the one that gets us all the way to the finish line. And how do we harness all the assets that we've purchased, all the human capital that we've ramped up, all the investments that we've made? How do we make sure that we can monopolize that capacity into something else for our companies? Because you think about the mix of, like, we just look at vaccines in a snapshot, right? The five we hear about in the United States are, I think, a testament to a robust, innovative biotech sector. We have 3 companies that everybody in the world has heard of, and 3 companies, if I'm doing my math right, who probably nobody has ever heard of until February. And I think that's what shows you the importance of having an innovative ecosystem for biotech development, and particularly in the United States, is we do have these large established companies. They get demonized in the press, the Congress hates them depending on the day, but their successes are what breed the ability for all these smaller companies to succeed. And we need that now, right? We don't know if any one of these individual vaccines is going to be successful, and we hope more than one is. And it might come, and I hope, being a biotech champion, I definitely hope it also comes from some of the small guys to prove the importance of keeping that moving. So it's sort of a lot to say, but I think it's just a lot to think about because of how fast everything is moving, safely, by the way, but how fast everything is moving. And that projection out 5 years, 10 years still matters, I think, in a lot of these companies.
Hey, Christina. So there are a couple of things that I heard John talk about, and I think this is a really great question because there is a pretty big change in the way that HHS, state governments, and others are sort of treating medical device companies, and sort of the laws behind those changes that they've made have been probably even more interesting. So first, before the pandemic, with our supply chain, the role of HHS and state governments tended to be around inspections and auditing and making sure that things were done sort of safely. And it still is a focus of HHS, and I think it's still their #1 priority. But there's also this other priority that's come up, and that is supporting the global medical device supply chain. And so, for instance, you've got Project Airbridge, during the beginning of the pandemic, which really was the big reason why a lot of these medical devices were able to get to the hospital systems and other distributors early on. Literally the government, working with airline companies, FEMA, others, to make sure that products were coming into the United States and that they were being placed in the right places. And so, that's been a really big change. And then, related to that, we've seen a lot of stockpiling legislation, and it's very different in every state, and the requirements for hospitals are very different as well. So, you've got a law that it's just about to be either signed or vetoed by Governor Newsom in California. You've got a really hard executive order out of New York related to stockpiling. So, for instance, hospitals in New York have to have a 90-day supply of medical devices within their actual ownership within that hospital. And so those stockpiling legislations tend to go back to licensure for these hospitals as well. So they're not allowed to function at full capacity if they don't have this stockpiling presence, for instance. So that's a big change. And beforehand, you'd see large distributors sort of having these warehouses that they could sort of manage the supply on. And now, a lot of these stockpiling requirements are going down to the hospital level for the first time. And you're primarily seeing it in California and New York, and I think that's some of those laws are maybe leading to an inefficient allocation of resources sometimes when certain places in the country really need them, but then Hospitals in certain states are trying to build up their stockpile to meet government requirements. And so, there's a lot of different changes both on the state and federal level, and those changes interact with each other as well. And it's been a very interesting month it's been a very interesting 8 months from the medical device supply chain perspective. But
I'd say, as an end user of telemedicine, as well as implementing telemedicine on a pretty broad scale, the biggest change has been the easing up of the regulatory environment that allowed innovation and seeing what other healthcare delivery models could look like. And it'll be interesting to see how those regulations come back in once you've seen that there are other ways to deliver healthcare, particularly ones that decrease disparities between, a rural and an urban environment, or a poor and a rich environment. So it'll be very interesting to see how that comes back on.
Yeah, I agree with Matt, but also in the context of the manufacturers, in the desire, of course, to get out COVID-19 countermeasures, the relaxation of the regulatory system, whether it's that you don't need an NDA to go to market if you're a new drug, but can go out with the EUA, whether it's the potential tort liability immunity, even associated with off-label uses of your products that before this you would not have seen. In different aspects like that encourage innovation and encourage manufacturing and pushing products out to the market. It'll be fascinating to see, as Matt said, when this is over, how that gets rolled back in, and as the immunities expire and sunset over time, what position that puts manufacturers in terms of their potential litigation exposure.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is interesting that's kind of everyone's touched on to a certain extent is the fact that there's a lot of changes coming, and they're all coming very quickly. And I'm wondering if you all could share some thoughts on what sort of pitfalls this might create. Like, do you see any sort of legal stumbling blocks that may come as a result of everyone moving so quickly and everyone trying to take on such sort of large tasks and do it very quickly?
So Christina,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's something I've found interesting, and which has been a real important point in AdvaMed, at least during the beginning parts of the pandemic, was related to some pricing inefficiencies that we saw in the market. And I think everyone saw that in the beginning, where you found new sort of third-party middlemen that came into the market early on, and they would charge 5, 10, 20 times as much for a product than what they purchased it for. And this was a real problem with masks early on too. And you saw a lot of unfair, gouging related things from, a lot of these third-party folks. And, I think everyone probably has a vivid memory of those scenes where the FBI had sort of raided these houses and they found tens of thousands of masks within them, while physicians and nurses early on in places like New York were having to reuse, their masks. And so, what we saw was states implementing price gouging legislation, and we were actually pretty supportive of that effort, because what it did was actually refocused our healthcare system on the existing supply chain and making it better. But then you saw very different responses. So, for instance, Governor Cuomo, there's a new law out of New York that they passed very quickly. It's Senate Bill 8189, and that price gouging legislation is actually very thoughtful. And if you read it, it makes a lot of sense. It essentially says that a manufacturer or distributor is allowed to keep the same margin of profit that they had before the pandemic. But then you saw other price gouging legislation, like out of Illinois, that said you can't raise any prices at all, no matter what, for medical supplies. And so those are two very different things, right? New York is caring about the margin and trying to keep that the same, while Illinois is saying you just can't raise prices. And so when the input cost of these devices rise, in Illinois, it's a lot harder to meet the price gouging legislation because your inputs have increased. But in New York, it makes a lot of sense with the way that their law is structured, and you can sort of raise prices to meet the rising input costs. And so, a program that AdvaMed had early on was something called Vent Connect, where we would connect our ventilator manufacturers with the different manufacturers of input products that go into the manufacturing of vents. And we worked with Google and others to really look at the global supply chain and figure out, where exactly are the component parts for ventilators. And, those component parts really started increasing because everyone in the globe was looking for these parts. And so, I think there's sort of a fine line between, price gouging legislation that works and that really, and then there's other laws that really don't work. And, you really have to walk a fine line. And, but yeah.
Well, I think one thing I would say, following on to Montan's question is, or sort of statements, and I think from a legal pitfall concern that I have, sitting in DC, advising companies both on the political side as well as the legal side, it is all going to relate to pricing of new products. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit from the political legal perspective, because I do think there's probably a lot of considerations on product liability that should be addressed, but I promise you, Jeff is smarter on that stuff than me, so I might as well not screw it up, and we'll let him, if he wants to, talk about it. But on the political pricing side, in the States, you're seeing this coming out of the woodwork in the price gouging statutes, because that's the sort of that's the police authority that they have. On the federal side, this election will make a big difference in terms, I think, of how different congressional committees treat resulting products that come out. But there's already an intense focus in the overall rubric of companies developing products on folks saying, well, most of that was funded by government money. Most of that was the product of government investment. And as a result, and you hear this more and more, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's something you ought to be considering, right? As a result, if we're unhappy with the pricing or if we're unhappy with the access standards, the government should be able to march in and license the IP that is the product of that government investment. Now, there are a number of reasons why I don't think that will happen. I think there are reasons because I don't think the government's actually investing in some of this IP. I don't think they have a basis for it. But two, it ignores the sort of long-term investment most of these companies have made in the platform technologies that are the basis for a lot of this research. But I raise it because every product that comes to market in the COVID space, the day they have that press release that talks about what the pricing strategy is going to be, that is the only thing that's going to be talked about in the broader marketplace, right? It's sad to say that we could have a monoclonal antibody treatment that has just incredible efficacy, and in a perfect world, access barriers don't exist because we have a lot of supply. And all of that will not be focused on by certain members of the legislature and certain members of the press, and all they will focus on is price. And I think that will lead to these sort of legal conversations within companies as to how do we get in front of this? How do we educate folks about the investments we've made in these products? Because I promise you, every one of these companies has a story to tell for all of the outside investment that they had to get them through not just their initial drug discovery, but to keep the lights on for the past 5 to 10 years. And yes, there might have been some government money via Operation Warp Speed or BARDA, and all of that is really critical to keeping this infrastructure in place and also to speeding up that development. But I put it out there because I think that's the kind of thing that any company of the 760 or whatever the number I said earlier was, they've got to be internally focused on, okay, let's say we get that magic bullet, we're going to, unfortunately, and it's really sad to say this, we're going to have a target on our back too, because I honestly think that in certain political discussions, any price is too high for some folks, right? And so we have to, we as an industry are working very hard to get out and talk about the value proposition, the number of dollars and investment vehicles that have to come into these companies just to keep them moving. And we're only looking at a snapshot of investment, $8.8 billion invested by Operation Warp Speed, right? In that whole supply chain stuff. There's a whole lot more that goes into getting those products out to market. And so I raise that because I think we have to continue as an industry talking about, not only are we working to get these products out to patients as quickly as possible and as safely as possible and as robustly as possible, but every one of these companies has to think about, okay, when this is over, how do I keep all of my employees employed? What if we were the failure? What if our product didn't make it over the finish line? How do we keep the investment engine moving? Because you know what? We still haven't cured cancer yet. We still haven't cured Alzheimer's yet. There's a whole bolus of diseases out there that we still rely on this industry to be investing in. And all of that is colored by these conversations that are being had in the press and in the Congress right now, and actually in a lot of state houses, right? You're hearing this more and more, particularly out of New York and out of California and out of Illinois, states that are otherwise broke anyways. And now we're trying to figure out how are we going to pay for sort of some of these large public health initiatives. So I think that's a real tangible legal consideration every company is going to continue to have to run, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'll jump in there on kind of the product liability and litigation side of the house, where obviously with federal PrEP Act immunity, the idea is that your litigation risk is low and should be lower, if not eliminated in large part by federal immunity provisions. But I think it remains a big question mark for manufacturers as to how that will actually play out in process, because there's not a lot of precedent. There's a handful of cases, probably less than a handful of cases from prior pandemics, H1N1, et cetera, that interpreted the act and its scope and its meaning. You've already seen now in the last couple of months more cases on the PrEP Act applicability during COVID than you had seen at all before that. And those cases have really all been in the context of the provider space, and more specifically senior care and long-term care facilities. So it's a real question. While the act is very strong and provides very significant liability, immunity, and protections for anybody who's manufacturing, distributing, administering, using, et cetera, COVID-19 countermeasure, there are going to probably be some ways around it. For example, we're seeing right now efforts in the provider space to remove to federal court lawsuits that are being filed against those companies or entities on grounds that the PrEP Act preempts and immunizes those providers. And so far, I think it's 0 for 8 in terms of those efforts, and there are a ton of cases that are still left to be decided. Those removals have been rejected on various grounds, but at least half of them have just been on grounds that there's no federal question jurisdiction, simply by pleading it in your as a defense PrEP Act immunity. So right now, the early indications are that even if you get sued for some injury that arises from the use of a COVID-19 countermeasure that the company has manufactured, that you're going to be stuck dealing with that issue, at least preliminarily, in state court. And for a lot of you and depending on the plaintiff, et cetera, and various other considerations, that can be a fairly unfriendly venue to have to litigate issues, particularly at the beginning days when these are issues of first impression. So I think the companies are then going to be left with having to try to file a motion to dismiss on grounds that the PrEP Act immunizes them, and thus the plaintiff is left to go to a claims administration or can assert some sort of claim that there was willful misconduct, and you can only assert those types of claims before a panel in the DC District Court. And we just don't know yet what a lot of state court judges are going to do with that. I'm optimistic that they'll do the right thing, that the law is so broad and is so clear in many respects in the context of a manufacturer who has made a countermeasure that then is alleged to have injured somebody, that the only possible result is a dismissal of that claim for it to be dealt with through other means. But I just don't know, and we don't know, and it's hard to say that if you make a countermeasure that ends up after that becomes politicized, or that has been rushed through the process, as some would argue, and it ends up not being as efficacious as maybe it had been intended. It ends up having a ramification or a side effect that is unanticipated, maybe in some respects. I don't know how some state court judges might deal with that, and it could potentially lead to some exposure that you're not anticipating. So I think that's still a big challenge out there. Most of the companies that I'm talking to and have been working with are not seeing that as an impediment to progress. And I think that's the goal of the act to start with. And so I'm encouraged by that. And I don't, that's a business decision at the end of the day, but from the legal advice and legal perspective, it doesn't seem like any loopholes, gaps, or potential unintended interpretations of the PrEP Act are really sufficient enough right now to stop innovation and stop the companies from moving forward. And that's a good thing. But it's always important to recognize the challenges that may exist out there.
Thank you. So maybe we could get Matt to jump in here. I know Matt's been sort of he's our end user, sort of out in the trenches on this. So could you let us know, sort of from your perspective and what you've seen from your work, what are some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges you've come upon?
Well, I talk about the disparity between, urban and rural, and to feed into what we were just talking about, it's really interesting to watch how, new products, innovations roll, from, where there's large sources of people down to these rural counties. And, some medicines like remdesivir, it took forever to get those out into the rural counties. And even some of them still don't have them in their hospitals. And so it's interesting, from an end user perspective to watch how, the supply chain works and what the barriers are, and trying to ease those disparities of living in rural community.
So maybe we can switch gears and go from our sort of doom and gloom and challenges to looking at some opportunities that you all see going forward. And maybe it makes sense, Matt, to start with you. I know you talked about a lot of the changes that you all have made in the telemedicine and sort of your telehospital program. Can you tell us about what opportunities you see for that going forward?
Yeah, telemedicine, the world changed when the iPhone came out and we started having FaceTime, and then you think how that can be applied to a medical situation. And like I said, with the rollback in regulations, it allowed innovators to experiment with how can you deliver healthcare in a different model. And telemedicine is one of those things that, as long as you have some connectivity, that you can, it's really a borderless system, and it's really one of the equalizers in healthcare as far as I see. And so I really think that we've been through another revolution because of COVID, because people can now, they've experimented with, they've played with, they've seen how healthcare can be delivered in different models. And so, as long as those, some of the older regulations remain off, it's going to be interesting to see how this develops in the future, because then other technologies can come in, like at-home monitoring devices that tie straight back into your hospital system, so that you can keep people out of the hospital, still providing that oversight of care and best care practices, but in a much lower cost environment and much less resource intense environment.
Yeah, and Dr. Lyon, I think that's a great point, especially when you're looking at the rural-urban divide as well. There's a great program that started out of New Mexico called Project Echo that tries to extend the ability of family physicians and other rural doctors by connecting them with specialists that tend to be in certain urban areas, and that program has worked really well. And this was long before the pandemic, but something that I've seen that, I find interesting from the legal perspective, and, I've over the last 10 years, I've really focused on licensure law and, things like certificate of need. I feel like the last 8 months have been moving faster, at least telehealth policy, than the last 10 years has. And we're seeing 10 years of policy being made in the last 8 months. And, one of the big things that's happening is a lot of federal level support on some of this stuff. I mean, not just related to coverage, but also, clarifying some licensure things and stuff like that. And you rarely see the federal government get involved in licensure laws. So For instance, I worked on a law that passed Congress in 2018, and it actually passed Georgia a couple of years before that. It's called the Sports Medicine Licensure Clarity Act, and it's a very simple law. If you're a team physician for an accredited sports team, let's say you're going from California to Colorado, your team is playing in Colorado, but you're from California. Well, your team physician can't practice in Colorado, right? And so what this law did was allowed team physicians to be able to cross lines and sort of waive licensure. And this law ended up passing in Congress in 2018. And, it was one of the really first ever laws that said something along those lines related to physician licensure, because since forever, physician licensure has been on the state level. State medical boards have been very protective about who can practice in their state and who can't. And that's really, really changing. And along that front, there's some scope of practice changes as well. Advanced practice nurses and others being able to do telehealth services without a physician supervisor. And, that's probably one of the things that we might see sort of reversed or changed, because I think some of these medical boards and others are going to really look at scope of practice and things like that, when the pandemic starts slowing down. But then you'll see some things sort of stick. For instance, the Florida Hospital Association CEO was talking about an order that Governor DeSantis had early on that required coverage of telehealth services, and how they are hoping to cement that. And this is the Florida Hospital Association. So, you're seeing some weird stakeholders change their minds very quickly. You would generally see this in stakeholder meetings over 10 years, 15 years, trying to negotiate some telehealth, changes in their state. But now you're seeing it in 8 months. In a couple of months, these policies are passing, and and we'll see which ones stick. And I think at the end of all of this, we'll see probably the greatest expansion of telehealth services that we've ever seen, and it'll I think it'll stick. I've used telehealth services since I'd never used telehealth services before the pandemic, and I've used it twice since. And it's been very interesting to watch how quickly states and the federal government are moving, and how far the federal government is going outside of their comfort zone. And we'll see if the federal government continues down that new pathway that they're taking.
But I think in a sense, to that point, Matan, the federal government has been forced kicking and screaming out of its comfort zone to places where we as industry have been pushing them for years, right? I mean, you think about these advances in telemedicine to provide for better care in rural populations. I mean, we've been talking about that for purposes of clinical trial enrollment in rural communities forever. And, for one reason or another, it has been difficult to get regulatory authorities comfortable with this idea of decentralized clinical trials as a method to permit enrollment of rural and in that case, not only rural, but minority and other underserved populations. And fast forward to holy smokes, guys, we got to test 6 vaccines in the United States, and we have to have a diverse enrollment population in each one of them. How do we do that? Well, guess what? We have to decentralize some of the clinical trial monitoring and permit the use of in-home tracking devices that work with a physician at a centralized facility, that permit telehealth visits. Because if some of the clinical trial control requirements are simply that you got to check in with a patient, well, the fact that the patient has to drive all the way to an academic medical center just never would have worked in the past, right? And I hope, quite frankly, that our regulatory authorities see that these things can be done in partnership with these private entities and with the physician community buy-in, and allow for that to roll forward. I mean, we've been talking about that, just in the clinical trial space forever, and then if you juxtapose that too, I mean, on the CMS payment side, right, it took 2.5 years to get a DRG for CAR T therapies, right? CMS took forever in the face of overwhelming industry and physician desires to make sure CAR Ts got adequately covered. And then, you fast forward to the pandemic and they say, look, vaccines are going to be free to everybody. And then someone goes, oh, wait, Medicare rules don't allow for that. Guess what happened? Like a week later, Medicare rules got updated to allow patients under Medicare to get vaccines at no cost sharing, right? We've been talking about cost sharing for vaccines and the dichotomy they play in the Medicare program between Part B and Part D for years, again, without the government taking much action. And I think this has been a forcing function. And I hope, quite frankly, that people are able in the advocacy community to use this as a way to say to the government, fast forward, hey, well, it worked during the pandemic. Why won't it work now? Guess what? We're even under less pressure now, right? If you were worried about mistake A or mistake B, like, here's how we can fix it. Just let the flexibility inure, right? We've been doing clinical trials based on paper for so long. I mean, there's no need to do that. I'm not trying to glom onto negative, reviews of regulatory agencies. Like, I think the FDA does an absolutely great job with the resources that they have and the staffing capacities they have. They're really, really good. But I just think this is that nexus that we all needed, that sort of catalyzes the next phase in regulatory review and regulatory payment. Because I talk so much about government payment policies because really they set the standard for all of the rest of the payment market, right? As Medicare goes, as Medicaid goes, so goes the commercial insurance marketplace, right? And in a sense, it's been backwards for a while as the commercial insurers have been so much more innovative because they, have medical loss ratios they have to deal with, the government doesn't. But I think this is that forcing function that really ought to help. And I think personally, and this matters a lot to bio, and it matters a lot to our boss, right? I think it stands to benefit the rural and underserved populations so much more by being able to get them involved in demonstration programs, in modeling, in clinical trials, in just areas they just never would have had access to in the past. And I hope that stays, right? I mean, I think of anything that comes out of this, I hope that's the kind of stuff that stays.
I think I'll just add on a couple points. It's always difficult as the litigator and the group to think about opportunities as opposed to just thinking negatively about challenges that are being created. And in a lot of what John says, you can see the flip side of significant challenges to the industry as some of those practices remain in place. If they do post-COVID, it just requires some adaptation, and time will tell how it plays out. But if I had to think of one specific opportunity that I think does exist for the industry, and I'm hopeful for this for all of my clients, and we'll just have to see again how it plays out over time. But I'm hopeful and optimistic about a bit of a brand boost to the overall industry in its amazing response to the pandemic, and the fact that essentially it's this industry that's trying to save the planet from this disease that otherwise there are very limited options to deal with. And it's everybody on TV talking about the rush to get the right treatment, the right vaccine, et cetera, the right care. And it's everybody on this in this summit and participating in these discussions, and the clients that I work with every day that are trying to answer the bell in that regard. I'm hopeful that as that effort is successful over time, that it helps improve an overall the brand of the industry, so that runaway punitive damages awards become less likely and more difficult to obtain. That there's a better there's a COVID aspect to the good company story that we're able to put together and help our clients assert in lawsuits and in litigation. Juror perceptions are changing already. They're changing as a result of the pandemic as a whole. Everybody now thinks they're a scientist, and everybody thinks they're an epidemiologist based on reading the news and watching the TV every day. That presents certain challenges for sure, but attitudes are constantly changing, and there's some opportunity, I think, for companies who, if and when they do get embroiled in litigation, to try to use some of the great results and the great kind of ability of the industry to answer the bell to their advantage. So that's a potential opportunity I see.
Hey, Jeff. One thing that I found really interesting what you said was our industry's sort of image, and sort of coming out of this, being seen in a better way. I think there's also another sort of hidden component that we're sort of forgetting, and that is the role of physicians and nurses in our society. And I think there's a real shift that's happened, at least when I've been talking to state lawmakers and federal lawmakers, and there's a real focus right now about that patient-physician, that patient-clinician relationship. And I think that refocus in our healthcare system to talking about how we're going to deliver healthcare, instead of just looking at sort of the cost-related issues, right? I mean, CMS waiving the cost sharing for vaccines, that's a very big deal, right? So that they're signaling that, hey, we're not necessarily, we understand the cost pressures in our society, but really what we're trying to do right now is make sure that patient-physician relationship is working, and that these physicians have these vaccines, that these patients are able to access them. And I think that's where our industry really succeeds, is when lawmakers, when others really focus on that patient-physician relationship. And I think it's all going to come from the sacrifices that we see physicians and nurses and others are making in our society right now, the number of hours that they're working, them putting their lives on the line to really help people every day. And we all knew this before the pandemic, but it's really you're seeing it every single day on television now, right? I just heard a story about a 30-year-old physician out of Texas, and you keep hearing these stories about physicians and nurses who are contracting, coronavirus, during their service to our country, and you see those people going on the front lines and keeping America healthy and safe and keeping our economy going. And I think that's one of the big changes that you'll see coming out of our society, is this refocus on clinicians, on healthcare delivery, and building up that relationship between patients and physicians. And I think that's pretty exciting to me, at least.
So just let me jump in here real quick. We've got about 3 minutes left. So if anyone in the audience has any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to submit them via the chat, and we'll have our panelists jump in on those.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll just jump in and say, I think that you make a great point, and I also, it's a very good one, and I hope it's also an opportunity. The strengthening of the patient-physician relationship is only helpful to life sciences companies in litigation as well. And you've seen some deterioration, I think, of that relationship in certain courts over the course of time, that have viewed that relationship has deteriorated with the advent of direct-to-consumer ads and a lot of other promotional techniques. And as a result, it's limited. It's worn away a little bit at the edges of liability protection that exists for pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers. And so it's really a great point, and I hope that it bears out in further helping manufacturers in their litigation challenges.
I mean, I'll just echo what Jeff said, because we deal a lot with not just the innovation cycle, but all of the commensurate legal issues that follow as companies bring products to market. And my hope too, from an enduring legacy thing is, right, we deal a lot with companies' inability to spend time talking to clinicians or talking to patients about off-label uses, for instance, and in the advent of regulatory flexibilities with emergency use authorizations of products, I think that's going to be a difficult area for both trial lawyers as well as regulatory authorities to balance. And my only hope is that actually some good comes out of this, and there is this sort of potential recognition that the scientific community within a company that developed a drug is probably best suited to provide answers to questions about a product in a responsible and I'll say in a truthful and non-misleading way, right? I'll toe the First Amendment line there, but my hope is that some of these things, as almost all of these are going to come out as EUAs, my anticipation, that engenders this conversation of, okay, well, it's EU aid. There's some modest protection, but there's not, that sort of labeled protection. How do we have these broader conversations in the scientific and provider community moving forward? And does that change the dynamic moving forward too?
So we've got a question from the audience. So someone has asked, do you believe there is a bubble of confidence for companies entering the biomedical field during the past 6 months?
I mean, personally, yeah, go ahead, Matan.
So real quick, I have a funny story. I mean, it's not that funny, but every month or so, I'll get, since the pandemic has started, I'll get someone from private equity call my phone number. And the last one was from a very big private equity firm, and you could tell it was just some analyst trying to run the traps for his boss. But his questions were, oh, what do you think the biggest needs are for hospitals related to the medical device industry? And you could sort of see that these private equity firms are trying to figure out how to invest in the right places during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think a lot of them are a little, they're maybe late to the game, but they don't necessarily, they also don't have the sort of past experiences to be able to look at things like the FDA emergency use authorization process or things like that. And there are private equity firms that are absolutely focused on biotech and med tech and things like that have really gone to market very quickly on some of their products. But then there are others who are trying to get into it, and you can see that they're sort of stumbling around in the dark a little bit, that they don't necessarily know where they're going, but they really want to go there. So that's at least what I've seen. And a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience in this market trying to get into it and realizing how complex the distribution model is, and how difficult it is to actually get a product in the hands of physicians and clinicians. And so, yeah.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think bubble of confidence, I think maybe there is increased attention to the fact that there is a lot of investment dollars available to biomedical companies out there. And I think to those private equity guys that are on the fringes that, to Mantan's point, don't know the industry, that there might be a little bubble of confidence. But I think when you look at the core consortia of private equity and other investors in the biotech space, guys like RA Capital and Deerfield, those guys are so intelligent and so good at what they do that, you might have a great idea, but you're going in like the biggest, most difficult capital raising, pitch of your life. And these guys know more than you probably about your product. So I do think there's probably a lot of interest, but I think the market is structured in such a way that the vast majority of the sophisticated biotech investors know the forest through the trees in that regard. And I think, to me, I think the ones that really get good, Series A funding, that get good preclinical funding, they have a good idea. And we need a lot of good ideas right now. So, is it a bubble of confidence? I'm not sure if it's a bubble in terms of the real money going to these companies, but I do think there's a lot of people interested in it right now. And there's a lot of people trying to think, oh, we make product X, could we turn that into the next treatment for COVID? We've seen a ton of that. But the market has done, I think, a decent job thus far, sort of sorting through that.
Yeah, aside from utilities, the biggest moat in probably any market is probably in healthcare, right? This ability to get things to the healthcare market is very difficult, and it's probably equivalent, but a little less than the utilities market, right? And so that moat in the healthcare market is really hard to overcome unless you know what you're doing. And it seems like the people who know what they're doing are getting EUAs and working with the FDA and others to get things done. Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably about all the time we have for today. We kind of run over by a few minutes. So I just want to say thank you so much to all the panelists for joining today. It's a great discussion, and I really appreciate all of your input in getting this together. And thank you to everyone out in the audience who joined today. I hope this was a fruitful discussion, and I hope that you can take some good, helpful things away from it. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Bye.
Christina.
Thank you.